especially if you want to use TypeORM in production. This is the video that you definitely should not miss. All right. Hey guys. I've been making a lot of NestJS content lately, and I've been getting some pretty good feedback in the comments. I very much appreciate those comments. Something that I always use in a lot of those NestJS tutorials is TypeORM, which I never really went into a deep dive explaining how to use it and how to use it with different databases and stuff like that. So I figured I'd make this specific video to cover just TypeORM and how to work with it, and add in some details that I didn't cover before, especially if you want to use TypeORM in production. This is the video that you definitely should not miss. So we're going to split up this video into 5 core parts. Part 1 is going to be setup and installation. How do you connect to your database? Part 2, we're going to talk about creating your entities, your tables. How do you write migrations, which you absolutely should know if you're going to do production work. And then we're going to talk about utilizing dependency injection to inject our entities into our services, which then allows us to do the actual querying, which goes into our part 4, which is the repository API, which that's where I'm going to cover things like how do you query your tables, how do you insert, how do you update, how do you delete, basically your CRUD, your typical CRUD operations. Those are good fundamentals to have. I'll also cover how to create custom queries. And then finally, we'll talk about in part 5 relations. If you have, obviously in a relational database, you're going to have relationships between your tables. So how do you go and get those relationships? How do you do joins and stuff like that? So we'll cover that in the last part. All right, so let's jump right into part 1. Setup installation. You can see that there's an npm install script here that we're going to copy. So I've got a basic skeleton application here where I use the Nest CLI to generate this. So it's just got a basic module and a controller and a service. I'm going to go ahead and paste that install script. You'll notice that I didn't copy the MySQL 2 dependency. I'm going to use SQLite here. And with TypeORM, it has really good support for pretty much all of the main relational databases that you can think of, like Postgres, MySQL. I personally use SQLite for these tutorials just because it's so easy to set up. I just install it via npm. I don't have anything else to configure, but you absolutely can use this with your own relational database of choice. All right, so once you've got TypeORM installed in the root app module, you'll then want to add TypeORM module.forRoot. And this expects that you're passing in an object that will be forwarded down to your database driver. So for example, if let's say we were using MySQL, right? You'll see that in their example over here, they're using MySQL 2 as their database driver. If you go into the documentation for MySQL 2, you'll notice that for you to create a connection, you'll pass in an object like this, which has at minimum host, user, database. It might also have password and stuff like that. So that's the object that it requires for that driver. So that's the object that you would pass into this forRoot method. Similarly, maybe if you're using Postgres, you might use the PG package as your driver, and that's going to have its own requirements for what should be defined inside this object. Now, what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to create a new file in the root called ORM config.ts, and I'm going to create the config here. And this is specifically because later we're going to use the TypeORM CLI, so I want this config to be accessible on that as well. So we're going to import config from ORM config, and then we're gonna pass that in here, and then we'll do our database connection definition over here. So I mentioned earlier that this object really could be almost anything depending on your database driver. One nice tip that I can add here is you can actually specify a specific type for that connection object. So for example, if we did have a MySQL database, you can do something like MySQL connection options, and it's gonna give you the shape of that object, which has, you know, type MySQL or MariaDB. And then you'll also notice that if we go into the interface that it's extending, right, it's asking for those things that we talked about earlier, like URL, host, username, password. Now in our case, we're not using MySQL. I said we're using SQLite, so we can do SQLite connection options, and you can also take a look at the shape of that. It just requires a type of SQLite and a database string as your primary required property. So we're gonna do type SQLite and then database, and I'm just gonna put DB over here. So this string here is gonna be the name of the file. So SQLite kind of saves your database into a file. So it's gonna be named just DB, and you'll see that in a little bit here. And then the main thing that we need for TypeORM specifically is an entities array, dist src, and then anything in that has entity in its file name, we're gonna assume is an entity. So think about it as we're following a convention, and we're using that convention to identify which of our files represents our database schema. And I'll show an example of that in a little bit here. So another option you can add here is synchronize, which you see is it indicates if the database schema should be auto-created on every application launch. It also says be careful about using this in production, and really you shouldn't use this in production, because what this will do is it will look for your entity files, and if it sees that your schema has a mismatch with what's in the database, it's automatically gonna synchronize your database to what your schema is. So that could mean if you deleted an entity, it will drop a table. So you got to be careful about making sure you don't have this to true in production. So this is really only should be utilized for local development, you know, if you're just doing a quick POC. And actually, let's go ahead and do a quick example for you so you can see this in action. All right, so in our src folder, we're going to create a new user.entity.ts file, again following that convention of having .entity in a file name if it's an entity. So we're going to do export class user, and we're going to decorate this with entity. So what does that mean? We're basically telling TypeORM that this class represents the shape of our user table in the database. So for example, maybe you have an ID in that database and it's auto incrementing integer. So there is also a decorator for that of primary generated column. So we can do ID number. And then maybe we have a second column for a name, which is just a string. Whoops. And you just have to add column here, and that's going to turn into a varchar column in the database. So now we have this basic entity. In our database configuration, we're saying that it's going to look for entities in the dist. So what that means is we need to have a build. So if we run build, when we run build, we're going to have a new dist folder here, and it's going to have src, and it should have an user entity.javascript there. So that's going to be found by this glob pattern. So let's go ahead and run our application, which part of the thing that does is it makes a build for us on the fly. And then what you should notice is that it creates the first time you run this, it's going to create that DB file over here in our root, right? Because that's the name that we provided here. Now let's go ahead and use, I have dbbeaver here, dbeaver, however you want to say that. And you can use this to, or your own, whatever database client you like to use to connect to your databases. Let's go ahead and create a new SQLite connection, which is in this DB file. I'm just going to open that. And when we go in, we can see the tables, and there's a new user table there, which has columns, ID, and name, right? So let's go ahead and let's try to simulate the synchronize happening here. If I were to, for example, add a new column here of something, let's say it's just another string. The next time that my application reruns, if we go in here and do a refresh, now there's a new something column, right? So that's what I mean by synchronize. It's automatically gonna make your database match with your schema that's represented by your entities. Again, that's very good for local development, very bad for production. All right, so let's talk about how do we fix this for production, right? We don't want synchronize to be turned on, so we'll do false. In production, what you should instead be using is you should be using migrations. And migrations are basically, you can kind of think of it as you're creating SQL scripts that represent the changes that you want to run into your database. So how we're going to accomplish migrations is actually through TypeORM itself. It has support for migrations. So to accomplish it, first you need to install TypeORM globally so that you have access to the CLI. So npm install -g TypeORM, and then you're also going to want to global install tsnode. That's going to allow you to run the CLI against TypeScript files. And then it also tells us that we should add this TypeORM script into our package.json. So I'm going to do that next. Now, once we have that, the next thing you're going to want to do is back into our connection options. We're going to do a migrations property here, which you provide an array. And this is going to say, it's going to tell TypeORM, where do I look for migrations? Again, we're going to do dist src, and then we're going to say that you should look in db/migrations and take any file in there that is any file that's in there. Now that tells TypeORM where are the migrations located. We also have to tell the CLI itself where to put the migrations. So we're gonna do migrations directory src db migrations, right? So we're trying to get it into this folder right here. So let's give this a shot. Again, remember that synchronize should be false at this point. So what I'm first gonna do is I'm actually gonna delete this old DB that I have in here, and then I'm gonna start dev again to recreate it so that we start with a fresh SQLite database. Okay, so you'll see the DB got added again. Now I'm gonna close this. We're starting from a fresh database. Let's go ahead and write our first migration. So one of the cool things with TypeORM is it can auto-generate the migrations for you. Again, this is why it's looking for the entities. It can look into the entities that you have and then looks into your database, and then it kind of does like a diff. It tries to figure out, all right, what's the difference, and then it's going to auto create a migration for you. So let's go ahead and see that in action. So in the package.json, I'm going to create a new command here. I'm going to call it TypeORM, or sorry, I'm going to call it migration : generate. And we said that in our configuration, we want the we want it to look in our dist again. So that means that you probably should run a build first, npm run build. And then from here, we're gonna do npm run TypeORM migration generate, and then -n. So it's really just this run TypeORM piece is running this script, and then we're doing a -n here because we're gonna need to pass in a name. So I know that's probably really confusing, but once you kind of see it running, it makes a lot more sense. So, and actually I misspelled migration here, so let me fix that. Now once you have that, you can go into your terminal and just do npm run migration generate, and then we can pass in a name of, you know, maybe we do user migration because we created a user entity recently. And you can see that it does the build, and then eventually it's going to run this part of it. And notice that it's passing the user migration string here into our -n flag here. So what did that do? If we look into the src folder, we now have a db folder in there that also has a migrations folder, and then it created this file, right? So it auto-generated for us a script that tells the database, hey, create table user with these columns, basically matching our entity. And you'll also notice that there is an up and there's a down. The down is always the inverse of whatever you're doing in the up. All right, so now that we have this migration, let's go ahead and figure out how to run this. So back into our package.json, I'm going to create another script in here for migration run. And similar thing, we want to run the build first, npm run build, and then after building, we're going to do npm run TypeORM migration run. All right, and let's go ahead and give that a shot. I'm just going to run it in this utility here, right? So npm run migration run. Same thing, it's going to do a build. It's going to find a migration, and then it's going to pass it down to TypeORM migration run. It's going to run it, and you can see it in the terminal here. It's doing a bunch of stuff, right? It's starting a transaction to create our user table. And if you go back into our DB Weaver, right? Remember I deleted the user table previously, so it's not there. And when I refresh this, because our migration ran, we now have a new, again, it's back, the user table. And then if we actually select our migrations table, which it also creates, it kind of uses that as a way to track which of your migration scripts already ran, and which ones didn't. So if it notices that the next time you run migration run and there's a new migration and it hasn't been added to this table yet, then it knows that, oh, now I need to run that migration to synchronize our database. So again, every time you want to kind of update your database, all you need to do is, you know, update your entity files, create any new ones that you want, and then you run that generate script, and then it's automatically going to create the migration files for you, and then you just trigger a run. And it's up to you when you trigger that run. So for example, maybe in production, you want to, as part of your continuous integration or continuous deployment, you might want to run your migrations prior to deployment. All right, so hopefully that made sense. Let me know in the comments if that was confusing. It can be confusing for people that are new to it. You also can create your own custom migrations if you want. So maybe you want to insert data as an example, which is not going to be represented by your entities, right? Like if you want to seed your database tables, you can create a manual migration where, you know, you just write your own SQL basically. Just make sure to add that to the migrations folder. And actually there's also a you can also do TypeORM migration :create, and that's going to create a new file for you that just has the up and down methods. All right, so for the rest of this tutorial, I'm actually going to turn this back to true just because it keeps things simpler so that I don't have to keep writing migrations and running migrations throughout this tutorial. It'll just make it so that our changes automatically get reflected into the database. And that's what I want for a demo like this. All right, so that concludes the first two parts of this video. We covered how to connect to the database and then how to create your entities and effectively represent your schema for your database, and then how to get your database to match that schema, right? You either synchronize or you do migrations. All right, next, what we want to do is how do we then utilize these entities to create queries against them. So for example, maybe we want to query all of our users. All right, so first thing that you want to do is within the module that you're working with, in this case, we just have this one root module. You ideally should be creating a new module for each domain. So in typical development, I likely should have created a user module, right? And then that entity would live inside it. But we're just going to stick with this root app module for simplicity. But just go with me here. Imagine that this is a user module. What you're going to do is you're going to add TypeORM module for feature, and then this takes an array of entities. So we're going to add user, and what that's going to enable us to do is within our services or providers, we can then add to a constructor, and you can do something like inject repository, and then we're going to do private users repository, which just has a type of repository of entity user. And then I actually forgot that you also have to pass the entity itself in here, which we also forgot to import, right? So we're importing our user.entity, we're passing it in here, we're creating a new variable in this class, a member in this class called user repository. It has this type. Syntax is a little bit verbose, but it's not too bad. So as an example, let's start talking about the repository API. So let's do the basics first. Perhaps you want to do a get all, right? You want to do get all users, which returns a promise of collection of users. How do you do that? You do this dot user repository, and let me actually make that plural, users. All right, users repository dot find. So dot find is effectively equal to select star users, select star from user, right? If you know your SQL, and make sure to return, right? So there you go. How do you find a specific user? Maybe you want to do get one by ID, which we said that our IDs are integers. So maybe we do something like this, returns a promise of a user, right? And you can do this dot users repository dot find one, and you can pass in the ID directly like that. You can also do find one or fail, which I personally like, because if you just do find one, that would be equivalent to, again, select star from user, where user.id equals the ID that you passed in, right? Which a select, if it didn't find anything, it's just going to return nothing, which is probably not the behavior that you want in a typical application. If you couldn't find something, you're probably want to communicate that to the user in some way. So you can do find one or fail, which what this will do is it's going to throw an error, which you can then wrap this if you want in a try catch, right? Like this, right? So if we were to put this in here, if you were to await, be sure to add your async, right? If it doesn't find it, it's gonna throw an error, and then you can handle that in here if you want, or you can throw the error back, right? So that's how I like to do finding by one. I almost always use or fail because I want to communicate when I can't find that thing. All right, next let's talk about how do you insert. How do you add to our table, to our user table? You can do, let's do a create user method here, which probably takes in the fields that you want, but let's say for now we just want to take in the name, which is a string, and we want this to return the newly created user. So this is also going to be a promise of a user. In our user entity, we said that it has a name property. I'm going to delete this for simplicity. So it's just going to have an ID and a name. So to do that, to create a new one, we're just going to do new user equals this dot users repository dot create, and then you pass in the fields that you want to specify. So in our case, that's name. And what create is, it's effectively equivalent to something like constant new user equals new user, right? And then, you know, it does new user dot name equals the name that we passed, right? So it's kind of a shorthand for instantiating that class. Now, once you have that creation, that doesn't mean that it's saved in your database. You still have to do this dot users repository dot save, and then you pass in your newly created entity. So if you look at the documentation for save, it says that it saves a given entity in the database. If it does not exist, it's going to do an insert. Otherwise, it's going to do an update. So that means you can also use this for updating the user, right? So this is going to do insert in our specific case here, because we're passing in a new that doesn't have an ID. So that's going to do a database insert. Since we sort of covered it, let's do update. You know, maybe we want to allow for name changing. So let's do update user. You know, let's do name again here. And again, we probably want to return the updated user, right? Like if you have a client, you almost want to get the new data back. Now, kind of similar thing, we saw that the save can do an update for us. So we're going to copy that, but we're going to do for us to be able to do this, we first need to find that user, right, in a database, which we already do. We've already handled in our code over here. So you can just do const user equals await. Let's add our async. This dot get one by ID, and then you pass in the ID, which we actually are missing in our parameters here, right? Or you can also use this directly if you want. It's basically the same thing. But if you're doing error handling like this, you know, it might be good to reuse. So this gets back our entity, it queries it for us, and then we can do our manipulations, our updates. So in this case, we're saying that we wanna allow the the application to change the user's name. So we're going to do user.name equals the name that passed in, and then we're going to save it. So the save is going to trigger a database update, and it should update that row. And maybe I'll demo this a little bit later, but I want to type out a lot of this stuff first. All right, so you can probably kind of see where I'm going with this. I'm effectively covering how to do CRUD, right? So this is your reading, this is your create, this is your update, and then we just need to do a delete. So we can do delete user. Same thing, we want to know who to delete, and then in this case we probably want to return the deleted user. So you can kind of do a similar thing here where you query the user first, and then similarly this should be async because we're awaiting, and then you can do await this.users repository.remove, and we pass in our entity, and then we're just going to return it again because we want to communicate to our client the object that we just removed. Or I think you can actually just return this directly because it looks like remove returns that same user entity, so we can delete this. All right, so that's basically your CRUD right there. If you're looking at the TypeORM documentation, you likely will also notice that there's also an insert method. So like this. But the reason we don't use insert is because notice that what this returns is a promise of the insert result, not the actual entity itself. It'll just say that, oh, it inserted one row or something like that, but it doesn't return the actual user that got inserted. Save, on the other hand, does return the user that got saved, that row that got updated or created. So in a CRUD scenario where you're creating, and almost always you usually want to get back the thing that you just created, the create and save combo is almost always the one you want there. Kind of similar thing for what we're doing with the update and deletes here. Like I think there's a delete method where you can just pass in the ID, right? So you can pass in the ID, but same thing, if you do it that way, you get back the delete result, you don't get back the deleted entity. And there's a lot of scenarios where you want to get back that entity that you deleted, updated, or created, because you want to inform the client or the user interface on what data is updated, right? So I personally would use remove there, but could be your own, do your own preference. It's also good to know that using the repository, you can also create your own custom queries. So for example, you can do something like user repository dot create query builder, and you can pass in an alias here. So in our case, let's name this user, and you can do all sorts of things with this. Like for example, maybe you just want to select the name. Maybe you want to do a left join, or maybe you want to do a where, right? So this is a good if you know SQL well and you have a very custom query and you just want to represent the SQL that you know into the JavaScript API. This is a good approach, right? So it has a lot of those things that you would probably care about, like order by, right, group by, kind of those core SQL statements. And there's really good documentation for that in the TypeORM query builder documentation, right? It's got all of this stuff, right? So take a look at this documentation if you want to learn more. I can't really cover this because there's so much. It basically covers like almost everything that you can do with SQL. So you can kind of just think, if you have very custom queries that's not something you can do with the repository API. Query Builder is your best friend there. All right, so let's maybe go ahead and test the stuff that we have so far. We have a basic app controller here. Let's go ahead and, oh, we already have our app service imported there. Let's maybe change this to do something different. So right now, if I run this, when I run this and go to localhost, it's gonna give me that hello world message. And that's because of the get hello that we have here. Let's go ahead and just change that to maybe maybe we're gonna create a new user and we're just gonna return that. So as an example, let's do return this dot app service dot create user, and let's just pass in a name here of let's just do my name, and then this is complaining to me because I did not import the user, right? So when I call that again, I expect that it's gonna add me to the database. So let me hit refresh here, right? And then it returned us that new entity that got created. And you can go back into your database viewer if you want. If we query our user table, now you should see that same row. All right, so we know that our user is getting created. Maybe let's do another one and then see if we can do an update. Right, so we're gonna create a new user with name test, and then we're gonna do this at app service dot update user, which requires an ID. So we actually want to do something like this, and we're gonna immediately update that name to something else. Why don't we go ahead and just return this? So what I expect to happen when I refresh the page again is it's going to create a new user with name test, and then immediately it's going to update it to something else. So I'm going to hit refresh, and we got back a new row, and his name is now something else. It ran very quickly, but if you slow it down, you add some timers in there if you want, you will notice that it first does create with test and then ultimately updates. So if we query the user table again, now we got those two. And then, just to make sure everything is working, why don't we go ahead and do our delete. Let's just do delete user, and then I'm just going to delete the first one, which is the one that has my name on it. Again, if I go back to my browser and refresh, it returns me that new deleted entity. And if we go to our database and we do a requery here, now we just have that second row. The first one got deleted, right? So all of our stuff is working. You can also do, I don't think I did the get all, and now this is going to return a collection of users, and I expect that when I refresh, I am going to get back an array of users, right? So all of our CRUD stuff is working. Obviously I did not create this in proper, I really should have created a user module with its own user controller and its own user service, but in this tutorial, we're specifically learning the TypeORM repository API and stuff like that. Make sure to check out my other videos where I do kind of show you how to do this properly with the domains for user and having its own module and such. All right, so finally, I think the last part that I said I'll cover is relations. So obviously with relational tables, right, relational databases, you have tables that likely have relationships between them. So for example, maybe a user has a pet. So let's go ahead and create a new pet entity. It's gonna do pet entity dot TS. And kind of similar thing, we're going to do export class pet. Wrap this in an entity. We'll just copy the same fields that the user has. Let's say that this pet has ID and name, and make sure to import any missing imports. And in the TypeORM documentation, it goes into a lot of stuff in more details regarding relations. So you can, if you know your SQL relationships well, you know that you can do stuff like one-to-one, many-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. And depending on which one you choose, TypeORM is gonna figure out for you how to represent that in the database. So for example, if you do a many-to-many, it's gonna create a new intermediary table for you that represents the relationship between your two entities. If you do something like a many-to-one, which we'll go ahead and do that actually, or a one-to-many, it's gonna add a new ID property in that table that represents the relationship. So let's go take a look at what that looks like. So for example, we know that a pet has an owner of type user, and we can say that we have a many-to-one relationship here, and you have to provide the type, which is user, and then you have to provide in that entity what's the matching property. In this case, it would be user.pets. And we got a red squiggly here because that doesn't exist yet. If we go into the other side, we can say that the user has pets of type pet, right? And you can do your one-to-many over here, which is the inverse relationship, which has a type of pet, and we're gonna do within those pet, we do owner. All right, so all of our squigglies should be gone. So now that you have that relationship, one of the things you can do, if we go back to our service here in our user repository, within the find, it has a special property that you can pass in here called relations, and you can pass in an array of relations. In this case, we maybe want to pull pets, right? We have this new property, and what this is going to do is it's going to do the select star from user, and then it's also going to do the join to get the rest of the pets, right? Join with pets. So to do a quick example here, let me run the application back in our controller. Since we're already doing get all, let's take a look at what that returns at the moment. So it's going to return the person with the something else name, and it just has an empty array of pets. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and manually add a new pet in here. Obviously, you can go through the same exercise we just did with creating a service for like a pet service that is able to create pets and stuff, but I'm going to cheat and I'm going to add a new pet in here instead. So I'm going to do a new insert into pet here with name, buddy, and I'll use an ID of 1 there. If we do a select of our pet table, now we got our pet there. Actually, this owner ID should be 2 because we deleted owner 1. Right, so in our user table we have just that person with ID 2. So we're saying that this pet, his owner is this guy with the name something else. So now if we go back into our application, if I refresh here, here you go. Now we're able to query the user as well as his or her pets. And all of that, all we had to do was add this array. So it's that's something that's super convenient with TypeORM, is that it's able to pull in relations for you like that. All right, so that's really it. That's the basics of it. You know, you obviously can change this as needed. Like for example, maybe if a pet can belong to multiple users, right? Like if it has a mom and a dad, This probably should be a many-to-many relationship. And then you can also specify in here stuff like what happens on delete, right? Like if you want to do like on delete cascade and stuff like that, you can do that in the configuration of this decorator here. All right guys, so that's it for this video. Leave a thumbs up if you found it useful. Drop a comment if there's anything that you feel I should have covered, or if there's other content that you want me to cover in the future. I would love to know of whatever you think. Anyways, thanks, and I'll see you on the next video.